but actually, I don't think it's not self-serving, because what you outlined there is exactly the reality that I'm dealing with in the book that I'm writing, which is, starting a company, being an entrepreneur is an issue of complexity, where you have a whole range of things, like way too many things, and they all connect and influence each other. And so the challenge of being an entrepreneur is you're balancing 100 different things. And the truth of being an entrepreneur is you don't perfect any one of them. It's how they all come together that's most important. There we go. Sorry about that.
I just
dashed off to get my iPod, so AirPods.
All good. It's all the Zoom dance, the whole ritual.
Oh, it is the whole thing. It's like, wow. Well, and I have primarily an educational account, so if I actually have to log in, I go through 10 steps, and it's all crazy.
And inevitably you show up in the wrong room and your AirPods don't connect and your Bluetooth. Oh my goodness. Yeah, it's a whole ordeal. I talked to Rory about this. Back then, it was during the pandemic. He was quite forgiving because I really disliked the user interface of Zoom, but he was comparing it to Microsoft. So he was like, no, it's pretty good. And I was like, I was like, yeah, compared to like other crap, it's not as crap,
Yeah.
It's not good, but it's like, what's your frame of reference? It's not hell, so okay. Does that mean it's good?
Well, it's like it's like that great quote about democracy, right? The absolute worst system, except for all the others. I think that's where we are. The thing I'm loving too is that Apple in the new new iOS software, if I do start doing this, it says you're trying to raise your hand. Do you want to raise your hand? I'm like, no, not really. So
since I updated to Big Sur on my MacBook and iOS 15, I've been having nothing but issues, Bluetooth issues and the whole shebang. Whatever. Anyways, I am so excited. I've been looking forward to this, to meeting you like the entire week. We've been
that's
talking
great.
Yeah,
me too.
We've been talking on Twitter a bunch and had a lot of fun back and forth. So yeah, I'm super excited that they were finally here having a chat. It's great.
Absolutely. Same here.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about your background, if you want.
It's the weird background. I started college in music. I got a degree in math. I went to work in aerospace on rockets and missiles. Literally, the Atlas rockets were built in San Diego by General Dynamics. That's where I worked. And then from there, I went into sales and marketing with supercomputers, and which is scientific computers. At the time, it was all scientific computers for engineering and science applications. So it was kind of an extension for me, but it turned out I was far better at communication than anybody had ever told me. So from that point, I ended up getting into an ad agency that specialized in half-hour direct response television infomercials, but we don't say that word. So I always followed up with, no, really, we did the good ones. We did brands, mostly we did big brands. I worked with Sony and with Apple and with a lot of big brands through that. And then started my own agency in 98 because I was getting frustrated with having really great opportunities for people. And this was fundamentally a production company. And so they approached it as producers, not as communicators and marketers and advertisers and the like. So they would make these glorious productions, and then I'd take it out and do research because I was VP of strategy. I'd take it out and do research and come back and say, oh, yeah, it's bad. Nobody cares. And but we could make them care if we did a bunch of things. And so I decided to go out on my own, started my own agency and ran it for 20 years. And so
yes. So when you're saying that you did research and you came to a different conclusion, are you talking about more like qualitative research? Talking to
in the case of that kind of advertising, we really needed to do qualitative because we had a half-hour show to understand. It's really tricky to know. You can't just post it online and have people watch it and make sure you're getting the right things. Besides, there's a lot to learn by watching body language, and a lot of the kind of other indicators we pick up in a qualitative world. So we bring them into focus groups, but we had a methodical way of watching it, because we found that it's hard for somebody to watch a half hour and not remember only the last 4 minutes. So we had little games we played to get them, where we have them watch a minute and a half and then stop and fill out without talking, just fill out a really brief survey. And we didn't really care about the survey results, but what it did is it kind of made a marker in the mind. So we could say, what'd you think then? And they were able to recall, whereas with it, they wouldn't have been able to. So.
Yes, yeah. So I just started Youngling Research Cohort 1. I kicked off a membership program for the company that I run, and part of that is a live cohort, and we do training and stuff like that. And I teach the students in that cohort. I teach them a bunch of stuff, and I use behavior design for like a feedback loop to see if they're applying it, etc. But I know a bunch of people who are in a tangential space as well, who do like education, entrepreneurial education, etc. And from those peers, from those colleagues, I hear the exact same thing. Like, you have a 3-day period boot camp where you're focusing on a specific subject. Say it, for example, how do you get people to ship? If someone is a bootstrapper, very early stage, all of the psychological hang-ups, etc. And I hear the exact same thing. People drastically overestimate their capabilities, and they underestimate just how quickly they forget. And it's not even tied to intellect. It's just there's so much information. You really. There's a Chinese proverb. I think it's Chinese. I saw it on Twitter, so it's always a bit questionable.
Now it's a Twitter proverb, so we'll take it.
Yeah. So it has to be true because I saw it on Twitter. But it was something akin to even the faintest writing is better than the most superior memory. Something along those lines. And it captures this idea that it's so tricky to remember stuff. I mean, that's like half of cognitive science, right? All of these biases and heuristics. It's like because you have all these bugs in your brain essentially, or features depending on the evolutionary psychology lens.
Yeah, because I kind of consider them features. They're kind of the reality of what we have to do because we're bombarded with so much. We can't, we have to pick and choose. Unfortunately, we also have to be aware that as we pick and choose, we lose a lot of stuff. Yeah. And so, that's where biases come in. We forget that. We forget that we lost the other part that would explain the whole thing of what happened 30 minutes ago or a half hour ago or a year ago. I've always been on that one. I've always been fascinated by people who think that you can do those two surveys that say, how much TV did you watch? Because nobody remembers that. I mean, you can track that in other ways, but we just don't, our memory for stuff like that, it's not very good. Because it's not necessary for survival. We remember stuff we have to do.
Yes, and if you're more scientifically inclined, like us, then the probability that you'll give an answer along the following lines is higher. The answer which has a shape of I'm not quite certain because I haven't really observed myself as a subject, etc. So then for the person who's taking the questionnaire, they're like, okay, cool, useful. Then I can kick this dude out essentially. But what most people will do is they come up with like an ex post rationalization of what they actually did, but they aren't aware of that. So they will say there's a little bit of a crass example that I can give, but sometimes you have these like informal YouTube channels who do like these clickbaity videos, but they go on a campus and then they ask women like, have you ever had a one-night stand? And everyone says no, but they all know someone. So now you have conflicting data because clearly it happens because there are guys, so you have proof that it happens, but no one is like admitting it. So there's like this rewiring of truth going on, and this can happen like consciously in this example or subconsciously, where it's like if you're in the supermarket and you hear certain music, do you think that that'll influence your buying behavior? And you're like, no, of course not.
No way.
And then
I think actually,
Yeah, my favorite one, by the way, is advertising. All the people who are not in advertising, like especially like the tech head Silicon Valley, it's always like that stuff doesn't work, which is why there's a billion-dollar industry, because it doesn't work.
Right. Yeah,
it works on everyone else except me.
I know. I got that question once from a client where we had done a campaign that sold 1 million units of a product, and it's a whole thing that sells that, right? It's the campaign plus the stocking and the store support. But fundamentally, what we do is, without an ad campaign, they wouldn't have sold more than 100,000, and with the ad campaign, they sold 1 million. And I mean, with some managers, you're like, well, do you have absolute proof that it was the advertising that made the difference?
We're not doing pure mathematics here.
Oh, dude, no, because you can't get that kind of absolute proof. But we know that no advertising would have been here. With advertising, it ended up there. Nothing else had that kind of potential for impact that you might have changed. So it seems reasonable to say, we can't tell you exactly how many of those units came from advertising and how much were advertising plus and how much were, because it's all a big system. But, in reality, if you hadn't had the advertising, you wouldn't have sold 1 million units. We know that.
Yeah.
So,
this is something that Rory really beat into my brain, because Rory's really big on being mindful of the non-measurable components. Whereas I kind of came from a school where I valued that a lot. All of the stuff that's not measurable, and then I kind of swung hard the other way, and then it was for a period of time. It was like, it's if you can't measure it, and super scientific, etc. And then that's why I'm so happy talking to people. That's why I'm so happy being part of the community and talking to guys like you, because it's so useful to be able to talk to all generations, people who are older than you, younger than you, yourself. You get a much wider and better perspective of a certain construct if you have a multi-dimensional view, essentially. But he, with his years of experience, he essentially told me measuring and facts, etc. That's cool, but remember, it's not everything, because there are so many things that are incredibly important that aren't measurable and that have ripple effects. Something that he talks a lot about is, for example, is fame, which increases the probability of serendipity and all of these things. It's essentially the whole idea of the long and the short of it, where it's you do certain things and they build your brand, but it takes a really long time. And then the direct marketing stuff, which is very measurable, very short term, etc. And then this balance. So I think it's very important.
Well, it's interesting because my career was spent all my advertising career was spent in this weird world where we were the unusual among direct response, because we were primarily introducing new products. So it was all new product introductions. And with new product introductions, there's this interesting thing that you do have to sell right away. I used to crack that, if you have a new product introduction and you're supporting both retail and direct sales, the problem you have at retail is you've got a 6-week interview with the buyer where he tells you whether you stay, you go, or you get cut back. And you got 6 weeks to make that happen. So traditional advertising isn't going to do it for you there. And you have to show some sort of impact in sales right away. On the other hand, with the new product, you have the opportunity to make that product part of the brand. You're bringing a whole set of new things into the brand. So it should have a brand impact. So all of our work was focused on both, let's get some near term, let's make near-term things happen, but we want to do that in such a way that we create the best long-term value. And I can't prove all the connections to the long-term value, but if I, instead of brand ads tend to come out and say, here's our brand. But with product ads that we did, you tend to come out and say, here's this cool product with this feature from this brand. And if you pick the features and how you describe them in a way that's consistent with the brand, you're building brand value. So, we did a lot of work for Kobalt tools. And we established this thing we called the innovation lab. Here we are in the innovation lab, and here's our newest thing. And the example of a tool that's innovative makes innovation believable. Whereas if you just go out and advertise, we're innovative, which my client at Lowe's do, we're innovative. Everybody goes, I've heard that.
Exactly.
But if you come out and say, this is our innovation lab, and here's a really cool product, and people go, my God, that's a great product, and you sell 1 million of them, you've improved the brand. And so there's the ability to do that. It's just a funny, we were in this funny never land because people like dichotomies, brand, direct, they don't, the two never mix. Well, we mixed them all the time, and I wouldn't recommend doing what we did instead of brand advertising as much as if we did it right, we contributed a tremendous amount to brand advertising.
Yeah. Well, that's essentially like what all the research has been showing for the last 20 or so years, right? That these and it's always tricky because you can't say the S word, but I'm going to say the S word anyway. These are synergistic.
Yes.
So the short term and the long term, they really do amplify each other. The same with marketing channels, by the way, right? Yeah. It's not TV or digital; it's both.
Yeah.
Because exactly, and not just because people consume content at various places, but also because the channels that you use, the context in which a message presents itself carries a certain signal in and of itself. So the same message on a cheap Facebook ad carries a different meaning than that exact same message on TV. TV has a certain, people are aware of the cost of a television ad. People are aware of the gravitas of something like that. So it establishes trust better than that same message via Facebook. But Facebook might be good from reinforcing that message, or reaching people you otherwise might not have reached. So there are like these back and forth things that happen, which create this 1 + 1 = 3 thing.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that's interesting is the work that I did, and this is where I feel like there's a connection with what you're doing, which is we did a lot of work for entrepreneurs as well. Because when you're an entrepreneur, I've called it the profit horizon. When you enter advertising, you've got to think about your profit horizon. When do you need profit back? And
it's really good.
This is a really broad stroke, but my experience is most brand agencies don't think about a profit horizon shorter than about 2 years. It's kind of, but if you're a startup, if you're an entrepreneur, you've got what, 3 months, 6 months? Yeah. I mean, you need it yesterday, but maybe
depending on whether or not you're venture backed.
Yeah, it depends on how much money you have. Even venture backed, are they willing to pay for advertising, or do you need to bootstrap your advertising? We did a lot of bootstrapping because you could sell product while you're advertising. You could turn profit from sales back into more ads. And there was a way that if everything worked perfectly, you could bootstrap everything. But you still needed a couple $100,000 to get started. And so it's not, it wasn't exactly cheap. Well, but what happens is entrepreneurs, right? What's that?
TV days, right?
Yeah, TV based. I do think that there's a challenge that entrepreneurs these days, especially with online stuff being so cheap. Before I shut down the agency, I noticed a lot of people who were just so enamored with cheap. And what we did was much higher risk in the sense that you're investing a lot more. But there are a lot of times where if you don't swing for it, you're not going to get there. So you can creep along doing little tiny things, but you're never really going to get, at some point you have to take the bigger risk. And I think that it's a trick with online advertising because it lets everybody get into it cheaply. But as you know, there's a difference between cheap and effective. And
that's a really good point.
What is that? So
there was someone who asked the question on Twitter, and I'm blanking on the exact question, but I remember my answer, and I remember that it was it was related to what you just said. Essentially, what I back in 2019 or something, I wrote an essay which covered like the game theory behind the mathematical game theory behind different kinds of games, and certain games,
right?
If they're of a certain kind, for example, you have a game which is zero sum. For me to win, you have to lose, etc. In those particular circumstances, there are two ways for me to win. I can win via actually winning, or I can win by letting you lose, and then I win by default. So I gave this example, which comes from the lecture series from Ben Pollack. He teaches game theory at Yale, And he has this example that he uses in his classes where it's like you both have a gun and you're like 20 steps removed from each other or whatever. You can take a step and then the other person takes a step and then you take a step, etc. And you have the gun and you can shoot. And if you kill the other person, then you win. And then at which point should you shoot? The key there, because there's a mathematically correct answer, but it's beyond this quick conversation.
Right.
But the key there is to realize that you can win by shooting the opponent and killing them, but you can also win by them shooting you and missing you, because then you can just keep stepping forward until you're like face to face and then you win.
Yeah.
So that it's important to realize that there are separate games, and it's important to realize which one you're in, because what you just said is true for a lot of business where you don't have that possibility of winning without taking chances, and the possibility of winning by letting other people screw up. And when it comes to, for example, I'm in the process of shipping a new essay, which it's a deep dive in all of the literature when it comes to first mover advantage and initial dominance positions, etc. And in those situations, there is a benefit of like looking over your shoulder in certain market circumstances and technological, the pace of technological evolution, whatever. But usually that's not the case. Oftentimes it's just the way to win is to win. The way to win is to take action, not by letting everyone fail, but it's almost like your default dead. If you don't do anything, you've already lost.
And I agree with that with the one tweak that I'll put on there, which is the way to win is for you to pursue your business, right? And pursue it full out. I mean, there is a tendency, I think, that sometimes we get too caught up in competitive analysis. And instead of, what my experience is that when companies look at their own stuff, I mean, aware of what's around them, but look at their own thing and say, how do I go forward? If we stay committed on what's our unique reality, then we end up winning far more often. I think one of the challenges, and I'm writing a book on complexity and business right now, and one of the truths in complexity that comes out of it is this thing I mentioned on Twitter the other day. You and I interacted a little bit about nomothetic versus ideographic, and the ideographic idea being that that's just that's looking at the unique situation in front of you, as opposed to nomothetic ideas, which are kind of looking for broad principles, general laws, and things like that. Reality in business is if we look around at companies that succeed, they always succeed because of the unique situation in front of them. I mean, they'll use a lot of things in other laws, like, how do you do accounting? How do you manufacture and stuff? But the things that make the difference between success and failure are the things about them specifically. And so as companies, especially as startups, we have to stay really anchored with who are we and what is it that we can deliver that is of tremendous value to the customer. So I fully agree with that. When I first started getting into like entrepreneurial science, etc., a lot of the information that I learned and acquired came from the Silicon Valley school of doing entrepreneurship, which is like it's such a warped, oftentimes just counterproductive view, because it used to be about unicorns, but now it's not even unicorns anymore. It's like decacorns and whatever. Like it's so far removed from reality. It's like it's not even the same universe. And also so you have that kind of like take on entrepreneurship, but then you also have the VCs and the angel investors, etc. But they are giving advice which is optimized for them, so you have this situation where a lot of the advice surrounding entrepreneurship is super counterproductive for like the average person. And when it comes to like realizing which general, even if you find general laws that applies, it's also important to realize in which domain you can actually apply those general laws. You and I, we both have a background in mathematics, and one of the first things that you learn in mathematics is that you always need to specify the context that you're working in, because there is nothing which remains true if you're allowed to mess with a context, which you always are. Like even as simple as even something as simple as 2 + 2 that always equals 4. Well, no, not if you're doing modular arithmetic, for example. Well, the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. Well, not if you're on a globe. Okay,
Yes.
well, we're on a globe, Okay, well,
Yes.
we're off. No, and I think that's exactly right. I think that's what's
Exactly.
I mean, for me, that's what's so frustrating as I write, so frustrating with kind of the staleness of so much business writing, which is linear, which assumes that we can find, we go find a company that's like us and we copy what they did, and that's going to be to our success. When in fact, our success has to come from looking at ourselves and saying, who are we? And how do we become successful using these unique skills and the unique environment we're in, the unique opportunities in front of us? Simple things like as an entrepreneur, you may encounter one really big client that you can kind of glom onto and use them to bootstrap or leverage yourself up into a big prominence. And then you're able to diversify from there. Other people, that's death, because then they're dependent on the big client and they're never able to leverage off into other things. How's that going to go for you? Well, it depends. What's your situation? What's your company? It all kind of comes down to what's right in front of you. And you can learn, you got to learn a lot from the other stuff. I'm not saying that, it's like mathematics. You got to learn all the math or, metrics even, in business, you really need to pay attention to metrics in great detail. On the other hand, you need to also pay attention to how metrics aren't everything. And that, there's so much that's not measurable. So it's, we're always in these inherent contradictions in business.
There are in entrepreneurial science in general, there are just so many issues, but it's in marketing science, it's the same thing. I shipped a piece on marketing performance. And how should you think about marketing performance? And in one of the papers that I was reading, it was from maybe 2005 or something, and that's just 15 years ago. And in that paper, there was again this critique, which you see in pretty much all of the soft sciences, which was like, we don't have shared lexicon, and we use the same exact word for, and 10 people use it in different ways, etc. And it's just. Now we're not even talking about what we were talking about a minute ago, where you're doing Euclidean geometry in a non-Euclidean space or whatever. You're not respecting context. Now we're talking about, we have a word and we don't even have a shared definition of the word. Well, like marketing, for example. So how can you have productive conversations? And one of the things that I hate about Twitter is, before I discovered like the entrepreneurial science community, the marketing science community on Twitter, and the people who are in agency life, etc., and take this stuff more seriously, I was part of the maker community, and it's like fortune cookies. No respect for context, no respect for definitions, and now we're doing astrology, because now I can make any proposition true because nothing has a definition. I can always post facto tweak it such that it becomes true. That's not productive.
We have a fundamental problem in marketing. What I teach my students about marketing is, I say, look, because I teach introduction to marketing at Portland State University here, and I teach. I say, look, I'm going to teach you everything about marketing, right? All of marketing, the full nut of marketing. On the other hand, when you go into a company, no marketing department ever does the full range of marketing. Every company specializes their marketing department to fit their needs somehow. Now, whether they do that wisely or not, we won't even go there. Let's not talk about that. Well, there's a lot of mistakes out there. But nonetheless, this is what marketing is. This is what the marketing department does. And that's one of our language problems, is that when you go into the marketing department, you may not see them doing things that you expect them to do as marketers. And that's not unusual at all. I'm trying to think. Bruce Clark has a friend who, I'll send you a link to a book that was written back around 2000 about this. And this is one of his points, is every marketing department does different stuff. So to what degree you can say this is the marketing department versus marketing. For example, product. You and I have had little engagement around like jobs to be done. And, how do you decide what goes into the product? Well, I see marketing having a heavy influence on that, but that doesn't happen in every company.
That blows my mind. I feel like it's the generation that I'm part of, and the kids under me. The younger generation maybe a little bit as well. But it just, to me, if you have to give one like heuristic that captures like most of marketing, and it's imperfect, but you use it as a shorthand just so everyone is like quickly on the same page, and you get a lot of bang for your buck. Right now, the heuristic that we use is like marketing equals content creation. because of people like Gary Vee, etc. They really promote that view. Like it's all about content creation. I would much rather have us use the heuristic where it's like marketing equals ethnography, like getting to know the users, understanding their issues. Because if you have a very clear grasp of the jobs to be done, the issues that customers are facing and consumers are facing, then pretty much all of it will like roll out of that. The pricing, what should the pricing be? The marketing channels, how can we reach our customers? You get much clearer on that because you have like the base knowledge on who you're trying to serve essentially.
Well, that's
and
it.
also
You
also product decisions, by the way. Product decisions also all flow from like the ethnography. By the way, there's like one caveat, which is like if you're a big brand, obviously then it works a little bit different, because then for bootstrappers, etc., the people that I work a lot with, usually you, in my opinion, you start with ethnography and then you make a product for the people that you're serving. But like in PNG or whatever, oftentimes you start with the product and now you need to find a way to make people want it. So that's in that situation, it's a bit different.
Well, I mean, a couple of thoughts for you. One is I think that, I've written a blog post about what I call the 3 roles of marketing. And it's where I start my students because, we all know the 4 Ps, and I absolutely am a believer in the 4 Ps: product, price, place, promotion. But it describes the functions of marketing. Whereas I want to know what the role is. And I think that's what's missing out of the 4 Ps is they don't tell us like what's marketing's role. So I give marketing 3 roles. And I'd say the first role is to know the world out there, customers, competition, the market, what's happening. So it's marketing's job to be out there observing. You mentioned ethnography. I mean, it's any of the flavors of consumer research, but also just tracking what's happening in the market and things like that. And then it's bringing that to the company and not running anything in a sense, right? This is one of the problems we have in marketing is that we tend to be influencers. We influence how the product's made. We influence what the design is. We influence a lot of choices made by the company, but we're the interpreters from what's out there to how does that affect what we're doing? And then there are some things we do, like, securing distribution and selling a product and advertising and those kinds of things. So we kind of have those 3 roles. And what's happening in marketing right now is everybody gets focused on the things we do, because they're easier to count. They're easier for the CFO to say, well, I'll pay you the money to do that because I know exactly what I'm getting back. Whereas paying you money to go understand the market is fuzzy. If we might say, how do you put a goal on that? Well, understand the market. Okay. Can we get a metric for that? No, you can't. It just doesn't work. What understanding? I mean, the understanding could be of incredible value, but it might be this one little tiny thing that makes this huge difference in the product, that you discover as you went along.
That's so true.
It's been big enough. I worked with a company that made wood joinery tool, and just basically for joining 2 pieces of wood together. And we were getting ready to make their half hour. And we did research and came back and talked about it. And I went off and did my strategy and came back and said, here's the scoop. We're not going to use the term woodworker because woodworker is a volatile term and it'll send people off into left field because a woodworker is somebody making fancy furniture, chisels and all this stuff. And what you want to sell to is the guy who wants to make a bookshelf for his daughter. And so if we're going to be making bookshelves for our daughters, we don't want to be called woodworkers. That's not aspirational to us. And so what is that? That's one word, but that has a tremendous influence on the whole process of what are we about. And so sometimes, that's what we're bringing back from that understanding. Yeah, sell that to the CFO. I paid you how much for that one word? Well, it was a good word, it's a good word. So, But I think too, I was thinking about, you the specialty in entrepreneurism you have, which I think is really fascinating. I haven't been very thrilled with what I've seen in, university entrepreneurial educations, because they tend to follow the same path as other business classes, which is to assume that there's answers, when in fact there's, I don't know exactly what you teach, but to my mind, there's threads. We know some things, we don't know some things, we know some others, we know examples. You got to learn all this, and then you got to make your choices. But I think that, go ahead.
Essentially what I'm doing right now in the membership is essentially I've been studying this stuff, like pretty much everything surrounding entrepreneurship obsessively for almost like a decade. And I sometimes joke that I have like 6 PhDs simply because of
Right.
the amount of time and energy. Because also, if you're
Right.
obsessed with something, you do it very differently than, you know, if you're, you know, you're doing it because you don't really want to go into the workforce, so you
Yeah.
continue
Yeah.
study. You
Right.
know what I mean? It's a
Oh yeah.
different level of intensity. But
Yeah.
anyways, what I really focus on is like the education that I think has the highest likelihood of being true. It's not mathematics, so you don't have like things that are absolutely true and they will stay true forever. But like, you know, you also can't say, throw your hands up in the air and say, well, we don't know anything. So it's like your best
Right.
guess. And I trust myself a lot in terms of like sorting out like crap from, you know, stuff that's actually good. And there's a lot of good stuff in the literature. But then again, you also need like people like Rory, etc., who have been like deep in the workforce for a really long period of time. You see this in research in how muscles grow. It used to be like you had the bro science, which was all the bodybuilders, etc., sharing their ideas. Then you had like the whiplash from that, where it was all like, no, if there's no paper on it, then, you know, it's nonsense, paper or else. And now you see like a happy middle in between, where it's like there's information from the doers, and then there's researchers who are trying to like fact check it and see if it's like domain constraint or whatever, or is it, you know, what's really going on here. And I think that happy middle is interesting. But what we really focus on is like the education, but also the implementation. So during the first week, we just wrapped up the intro to behavior design. And they were actually implementing behavior design. And I asked for feedback, like, what have you guys learned so far? And pretty much everyone to a T said something along the lines of, this was so much harder than I expected it to be. Because you can tell someone how behavior works and how you design behavior. And it's like, yeah, well, duh, obviously. But then you try it, and then you realize it's the same thing as like when you're young and you're single and you're talking to women versus someone explaining how you should talk to women. Like, once you do
it's a whole different beast. Yeah, agree.
Yeah, this is scary.
You know, I think, you know, with that, and with where your students are at, one of the things I find that's really tricky for startups is that they're caught in a real problem, a quandary I find with marketing, because you know, it's expensive to hire marketers, or you hire a social media person. So a lot of them just run off and hire a social media person. And they say, well, we're doing marketing. And then you go, you know, I mean, I come in with all my experience and talking to CEOs and all over the world. And then I come in and they're like, yeah, here's our marketer. And they're great people, but they have real limited experience and they only do social media. And what a startup really needs is kind of is an experienced hand, but they can't handle them for full time. And this is like, I think the real quandary is, okay, if I was doing a startup, I'd really want to have somebody looking just at marketing if I'm the CEO. But I really have somebody, you know, really smart and really experienced and who has wisdom from experience looking at that. But anybody like that, if I hire them full time, they're just going to muck things up because they won't have enough to do. And when people don't have enough to do, they do anyway, right? Yeah. And so they would, I mean, it's not bad, but they would meddle. And that would kind of screw up the company. It's like what we need. And I've talked about this some, that it's like a lot of startups would do well with a, you know, lunch once a month with the CEO and it's maybe another executive or two with a really experienced marketer where they talk over things. And then over time from there, you might do up to 2 lunches a month and then 3 lunches a month. And then, you know, you see where it goes. And it eventually would probably lead to hiring somebody more sophisticated. But early on, you know, I see people are making decisions all the time. But
oh my God,
people that aren't, people that aren't really, they don't know the implications of those decisions. So I go talk to CEOs, and I found that if I get in with a company and it's 6 months after their founding, usually it's too late for me to have an impact, because they've committed to decisions, and getting especially a technology CEO to change their mind is really hard. To say, well, wait a minute, why do you think that's the way to success? Well, I've been doing this, I know. All right, you know, you just can't fight your way through it. So it gets tough. So it's like, my advice to people be like, boy, even before you found the company, start having lunch with a marketer just every now and then. You don't need them full time.
Yeah, what you just said also ties into Steve Blank's point with the whole lean startup ideology, where it's like the CEO should be in charge of product market fit, because if he pawns it off to the salesperson, you can easily like dismiss the feedback, where it's like, no, this product is the solution, but you just didn't explain it right. Whereas like if you are getting that feedback yourself, then it becomes harder to ignore that people really aren't resonating with it, and maybe the product is a problem. But what you just said, I resonated with that so much, where you were like, because that's my view of marketing as well. I the definition that I use and that I think is most helpful is Tim Ambler's 2000 paper, where he used Pan company marketing. Which is everything that the entire firm does in order to secure customer whatever preference and increase profits for shareholders. If you're a bootstrapper, then obviously there are no shareholders. But this idea of this holistic view of like all of the decisions that you are making, especially when it comes to like product and who the customer is, that used to be so core to marketing, and nowadays I think maybe it's a little bit like my generation, but that has been lost, and it has been replaced by, as you said, like social media. It's all about like output, and then we'll stumble on the right answer hopefully, or we'll go bust. And that model it does work. It does work, but it works like evolution. If you are an organism, and then you care whether or not you live or die. But if you are like, like God or whatever, and you're looking at Earth, then it doesn't really matter which individual lives or dies, because the whole system works. It's like an ergodicity equivalent.
That's true, actually, which is one of the things I used to say, because, in the business I was in, there'd be like 10 vendors. And the vendors supplying this advertising for direct response television some of them would be in the business of statistics, where if they did 10 campaigns and one was a home run, they were happy. And that's fine for them, but it's really bad if you're one of those products, because you go in there and you're like, this is my livelihood. I don't want a 1 in 10 chance of succeeding. But I think that happens with VCs. I think that happens, a lot of places.
Yes. That's
an accelerator. We just need one of our clients to succeed. Yeah, well, I'm a client. I want to succeed myself. Hey, I was going to go back and say, Tim Ambler's the guy. Have you read his book?
No,
he has a book on marketing measurement that is good. And he's the guy that talks about how the company, this is what marketing is, and this is what the company defines it to be. Those are always different.
Exactly. When you were talking about marketing roles, the 3 marketing roles, his paper, one of his papers came to mind, where he talks about external marketing and internal marketing. It ties in. I think it's anyway. I think the other thought I have is that startups also struggle, and I think you're absolutely right that the CEO has to be the one kind of bringing forth the definition of, this is what we're about. This is the value we're delivering. What's tricky is so many of those CEOs come from a tech background without respect for what they don't know, maybe in a sense. In fact, it's really interesting. I talked about this in my book. I wrote a bit about how that'll be out someday. Anyway, I wrote a bit about how a lot of these guys come in and they thoroughly understand the complexity of the world that they live in, of developing products, right? Of the products themselves. What they don't necessarily do is project that same complexity elsewhere. So you see a lot of startups where the CEO thoroughly understands the sophistication and is really very sophisticated about how to bring a product out, but lacks the marketing connection to understand the sophistication needed in marketing to make that work. So, they're good at saying, well, let's design this product, and here we have to look at all these things, and that might be a problem over there. What they're not good at is understanding that the marketer might come back and say, that's all lovely, but you're missing this one feature. And with that one feature not there, it's dead in the water. And, that's really a struggle for them. So they kind of have this really rich view of their world and a really poor view of the rest of the thing. It's just from the many archetypes of CEOs I've met. I've met a fair number of those. Also, because I come out of tech, my transition to marketing surprised tech people, because I went full hog into it and embraced the full humanness of marketing. And I had one time I worked for a CEO who had come out of tech, and he came into the company. And at some point he turned to me and said, I thought we'd get along because you came out of tech. And I'm like, dude,
I'm fully buried in consumer marketing here, and it's all about people and how they make decisions. And even in tech, it was that way. I had this really great experience where we had a client come into town. They were my client, and my VP took me aside and said, we got a bunch of technical stuff to succeed at here, but I don't want you to worry about the technical stuff. You're the sales guy. I want you to show them, care for them. And so I took them out into, they were from Korea. I took them out into the Columbia Gorge and around Mount Hood, and we went out for dinner, and we paid attention to them as people. And that's what won us the business, because even though we were tech, and I really appreciated Don having said that, because he made really clear that people in tech still buy as people, even though we've come out of the theory that, they're buying it technically. Well, they are, we can't fall on our face technically, but they're buying it as people.
Yeah, that is something that I again, this is a problem that I have when it comes to the education surrounding entrepreneurship. So much of it comes from Silicon Valley, and they have this. Again, when it comes to mathematics, there is no such thing as mathematics. You have to specify what kind. Because like if you look at like topology, for example, so many things are allowed in topology. Like imperfect shapes are the same because you can like bend it out and then it's the same shape, etc. But when we're talking about like I don't know, a completely different field, then all of a sudden you need to be very mindful of like minor differences in the shape of a curve, for example. And then you can't, like when you're differentiating, or for example, then it's a huge difference when you're integrating or whatever. Exactly. So you need to be very careful with that. And too many times people don't specify these domain issues and these context issues. You have the VCs that we just talked about, which aren't, I think probably some of them just aren't aware, and maybe a few of them aren't honest about it. But we just mentioned this ergodicity example, where it's like you throw 1,000 people off the cliff, one person flies, and soars through the skies. Is that situation good or bad? That depends on your perspective. If you're one of the 999, it's clearly bad. If you're invested in the entire cohort, then it doesn't matter if Johnny succeeds or Timmy succeeds. It's all the same to you. So, but these are things that we aren't clear about, and usually they try and like poo-poo it a little bit, and they're like, well, a VC is like rocket fuel, blah blah blah. You should only take it if you really want it. But that narrative conflates, is orthogonal to the actual content, because when they're presenting the content, it's more like a lottery, where it's like, everyone should do this, and how they sell the lottery tickets, like try and like imagine if lottery tickets things were honest, and it's like there's zero chance that you will win. Don't invest. So it's kind of like
it's kind of a business. I mean, in business, we've gotten hooked on this idea that there's a way, right? We've gotten hooked on the idea that there's a way. So the VCs come out and say, here's the way to be successful. What they're really saying is, this is our way. This is the way we work, or this is what we look for early.
But it's for, the key point to stress there is that it's for them.
Yeah.
Because what you want is a group of 1,000 founders and one succeeds. So it's beneficial for them. But the chances that it's beneficial for the founders are very low.
Yeah.
There's a very high probability of that. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that, it's a serious problem with how that all works. But I think it's everywhere in business, because if you look at people, they say, well, here's the way to do product research, and here's the way to do this or that. And there isn't, we're not looking at context. We're not looking at the specifics. We're not looking at the uniqueness of our situation. I mean, people laugh because I used focus groups extensively in my advertising work. Why? Because they were what we needed, and they worked really well. Not because they're the only thing to use. We also used, my first research project was more of an ethnography project. I've worked, we did a lot of quantitative analysis as well. But when I'm trying to figure out how to construct a half-hour show to persuade people to buy a product, I need to be testing ideas. And the best way to test ideas was in focus groups, where you could get really good feedback from people about, we did a different kind of focus group, not a let's get together and talk focus group, but we would come in with stimuli and work them through a set of stimuli and watch for what made a difference. So here, this product does this thing for you. What do you think? Yeah, that's a big deal. I don't get it,
And what about the external validity, the findings from that particular experiment, and how well do they generalize to the average population?
I mean, I can't explain to you scientifically why they were so effective, but what I found is that, and I think it had to do with the fact we were doing longer forms of communication, right? Because we were weaving a half hour, we would have to come up with a half-hour thread that held everything together and a path through. And they ended up being pretty universal in that we would go to multiple cities and find out there really wasn't much difference between cities, because in the US, you worry about that. It's, the Midwest different from the West Coast. And so we would do that and we'd listen. And what we looked for, though, was because we were looking at ideas, not at copy. So we didn't go out and test copy. What we were trying to do is get to the idea, like this screwdriver or this, this joinery product, you're going to be able to build a bookshelf. And you'd listen for, okay, what kind of questions do you have? Talk to us about that. And we'd learn those details about how those people thought. And I think somehow that ended up being fairly universal, the how do you think about it? What we would do as far as creative is we always approached it. And I had a researcher I worked with the whole time. And, she and I talked about how our approach was, if we know what needs to be communicated, then creatives are brilliant at communicating. So our job was to figure it out,
Yes.
And then we never, I actually, a couple of times I was forced to test creative and I hated it because it's not a very good, I don't find it very effective. Because it's much, first of all, it's much more effective to test earlier and learn what the creative needs to get across than to just go in and test creative, at which point you may not learn that. So I guess I would say our experience was it was tremendously universal, although I can't explain all of that. Rory might have an idea. That's a good question. I'll start looking in my complexity stuff because I think there's something human about it and kind of a shared human approaches. We were looking longitudinally, because if that makes any sense, for what is the process by which you come to appreciate this product. So that's what we're looking at is, okay, you start here, where do you start? Now, what things move you along that path? And I mean, the problem with as an experiment is we would, between day 1 and day 2 of research, rework the material or put it in a different order because we used it as a learning mechanism for us. What order is going to be most effective? What things do we need to talk about before we talk about other things? Because that's all really critical in how people respond to things. If they know this one thing, then they'll respond positively to point B. But if they don't know point A, point B just goes right past them because they don't have any context within which to comprehend it. Does that make any sense? It's kind of like, if you look at a lot of the, at a marketing funnels, there's one version that starts with awareness and then goes to understanding. It's the version I like and I use. But in the idea is aware of your brand versus I understand why your brand might be important,
useful to me.
The problem is we tend not to retain as awareness anything if we don't understand why it's going to be useful to me. Right.
I see.
So there's kind of this weird thing.
Feedback loop.
Yeah. If you don't, if you don't, I did a campaign for this thing called the Drill Doctor Drill Bit Sharpener. I know I worked the really interesting things. Anyway, they had gone out and done research with a major agency in the Midwest, and the agency had done a phone survey and come back and they had scored a 2 out of 5 in interest in purchasing the product. But think about what they did on the phones. They called people up and said, we have a product, it sharpens drill bits, you can buy it for $99. And of course people don't like it because they don't know why they should care. And what was missing in that gap was, why should I care? And because, as we found out, people didn't even know that drill bits could be sharpened, much less that, that there was a value to them of sharpening it. But that got us very focused in our advertising work, that what we had to do is build a rationale or reason around why would I care to sharpen the drill bit. With that, what ended up happening is it flipped that equation to a 4 out of 5 or a 5 out of 5.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
without that
Positioning.
information, they're at a 2 out of 5. And this is where, so I spent all my time in that kind of information communication. Like, how do you construct this so that people care? I suppose
This is also an important context difference that we don't pay enough attention to, because this is exactly the thing that I mentioned 15 minutes ago or whatever, when I said that oftentimes when you're bootstrapping and you're really constrained in terms of resources, you don't have the luxury of making a product and then trying to create demand.
Right.
But a lot of the knowledge, a lot of the information out there when it comes to branding and marketing, etc., comes from bigger companies where it's like, where you do that, you do create a drill bit, and now it's like, okay, we have the thing, now how do we sell it?
How do we sell it? Yeah.
Exactly, and it obviously can be done because it's there are many companies that are insanely successful, and then you get into the work of Bernbeck and Ogilvy with creatives and whatever. By the way, you mentioned that the order there, and that it's very important to first do the marketing, first figure out what people actually want, and then use the creative to communicate that. Dave Trott has a line about that. He always says that advertising is not marketing. Advertising is the voice of marketing. So first figure out what the hell needs to be said, then go to the creatives, and then have them come up with a good way of actually saying it. One of my favorite ads is the Volkswagen snow plower ad or something, like what does the snow plow fella what kind of car does he use to get to the snow plow thingy? Exactly. But something that as creative as that, that can only come from like the knowledge, if you first figure out like what the hell are we trying to say, and how are we trying to persuade people of what exactly? And then if you're clear on that, then you can make creative. So there's this commutativity which you don't have. You can't switch the order. There's a fixed order, and you need to be aware of that.
Yeah. I think, it gets towards something I was going to mention there as you're talking about brands. I think in terms of brand research, we also suffer that a great deal of the brand research has come through consumable goods, right? That a lot of the brand research started with Johnson & Johnson, and then you've got P&G. And there's a real difference between consumable goods and hard goods. And I think that the advertising business and the brand business suffers for that. I don't know if you know the curmudgeon Bob Lutz at all. He worked at General Motors, and he wrote a book that is pretty good called Car Guys versus Bean Counters. And,
So it's this problem with the FMCG versus products that don't fit into that category.
Yeah, he's like, look, it's got to be a car people want. And so, you can do all this brand stuff, but it's got to be a car people want. So how do you make cars that people are enthusiastic about, as opposed to how do you make cars that fit a brand thing? And I sometimes have looked at it that if you're in the consumable goods world and you have a white substance that you put in one bottle and call it Bob's Skincare and sell it for $2, you can add a little fragrance to it, put it in a fancier bottle and sell it for $10 as Susan's magic skin cream, and that works in that world. That doesn't work in the world of hard goods, and I think it's one of the mistakes I think that Silicon Valley has made is they brought in brand people because they were told they should, but they were all brand people from a consumable point of view. Now, I've worked with brand people in kitchen hard goods and tool hard goods, and some of the more just funky, fundamental, Silicon Valley's like, really, tools? But I love that stuff because these guys tend to really know about product. And
I agree.
If it's a 10-inch saucepan, it's a 10-inch saucepan. You can't make it into something else. So you have to figure out how to sell and market a 10-inch saucepan. And it's a very different thing from, white stuff in a bottle. And a lot of brand stuff is based around the idea that brand is this thing you can kind of move it around. I talk about it's like brand as trading cards. You have all your Pokemon cards. Hey, I'll trade you a Pikachu for I'll trade you 2 Johnson & Johnson furniture polishes for a toothpaste. Can we make that trade?
Yeah, that's fascinating. All right, there's one thing that I really want to ask you because I'm super curious to hear your thoughts on this. obviously the whole field of entrepreneurial science and all the sub fields and consumer psychology and everything surrounding marketing and branding, etc. It's very complicated. It's very complex. It's very difficult to separate fact from fiction. And something that we've already mentioned quite a bit during this conversation is that, certain things are very tricky to measure, but they can still be true. And we also talked about, the problem with like general laws, etc. So now the question is, how do we avoid turning this into astrology, where it's like, well, it's very complicated, so anything goes. I can make a good argument for anything, and because I think that's the problem that you want to avoid, because now you start to get into scientism. So there are sometimes, which I see in philosophy, there's a term called bullshit, which is a term used in philosophical literature. And the idea is that there are people who are truthful, so they are aware of the truth, the truth value of a certain proposition, and they give the same truth value. So true, false. Then there are liars, which invert the truth value of the proposition. So they know something is true and they tell you it's false. The most dangerous people are bullshitters, because they don't. There is no correlation between the truth value of a proposition and what they say, because they don't care. The only thing that they care about is using sentences and communication as a means to an end. So they will say whatever. And the problem with that is that a liar needs to be aware of the truth value of a proposition in order to invert it. But a bullshitter need not be aware of anything, because it doesn't matter. So in our sphere, you see a lot of liars, which is a problem to an extent. But the worst part is like all of the bullshitters. Yes, and that is marketed. That is the mouth breather marketing Twitter scene and the maker scene, where it's all about engagement, and who gives a crap? Just write something that people already agree with. And now you get into all these issues. So how, in your opinion, can we combat that, and can we avoid this scientism?
I can't offer a complete right. I mean, I'm going to go ahead and say, I don't know, I'll give you my thought. Right?
You have 30 seconds.
And it's going to sound a little self-serving here at the moment, but actually, I don't think it's not self-serving, because what you outlined there is exactly the reality that I'm dealing with in the book that I'm writing, which is, starting a company, being an entrepreneur, is an issue of complexity, where you have a whole range of things, like way too many things, and they all connect and influence each other. And so the challenge of being an entrepreneur is you're balancing 100 different things. And the truth of being an entrepreneur is you don't perfect any one of them. It's how they all come together that's most important. And what I'm writing about in complexity is, I'm saying, my definition is this, which is complexity is about the coherent whole, right? Everything in business is about reduction. Well, we'll go look at finance. We'll go look at marketing. We'll go look at product here. We'll go look, and we split things out with the idea that if we perfect every area, we'll reach the best, whole result. Well, that's not true. And it's especially not true in entrepreneurism. You can't be perfecting things. Entrepreneurism is a case of judging, near hits. Back to Rory, to use a Rory Sutherland, right? It's not about being precisely wrong. It's about being roughly right. So if you take a look at entrepreneurism, it's really a question of it's a complex issue. What is the whole that you can pull out of all those things? So you're right. If all these people are out there shouting for the entrepreneur's attention, wanting the entrepreneur to buy into their one system, but the truth of being an entrepreneur is you have to balance these things, and you can't buy into any one system. So you have to approach it looking at, what's my whole result? What gets me the best whole result, as opposed to trying to pick systems, which is what we're trained by so much business training. And it's now, that doesn't necessarily answer exactly how you do it. In what I'm writing, though, coming out of complexity science, there are a series of what I'm calling forces that affect this. Like when two things are connected, they'll affect each other. And sometimes you don't know they're connected until you get started on them. And that affects entrepreneurs all the time. Well, I did this, but then that happened. What the hell? Or emergence. is really critical. You know, a lot of times you can't sit down at the beginning and plan something. You have to allow it to emerge as you proceed. So I'm looking at these 12, you know, actually I'm looking at 11 forces and saying, okay, let's look at all these, you know, what about something that has a nonlinear response? And I think about more stepwise nonlinear than, you know, just bumpy curves. But if you're hiring, if you got 4 people in front of you, that's a stepwise nonlinear thing, because there may be one person that's outstanding. On the other hand, maybe they're outstanding only if they work for boss A as opposed to boss B. You know, you've got a lot of these nonlinear
unknown variables. Yes. Yeah.
And you have to make judgment calls about them. And so you have to sit back and say, I know all these kind of crazy things are happening. The successful entrepreneur figures out how to pull together the most effective mix of them. You know, we talk about marketing mixes. I mean, in a way, an entrepreneur is doing a company mix. You know, what's the best mix? Do I source some code from outside, or do I not like the project debt that I incur by sourcing that code? You know, all those kinds of trade-off things. And that's what entrepreneurship is about. If we somehow could talk about it, I think we're in the realm of complexity, then it might might help people more. If we keep trying to break entrepreneurism down into reduced bits, you know, can you check off marketing? Can you check off this? Can you check off that? Then we can't, you know, it's not as helpful. So anyway.
Yeah, I read a paper a really long time ago, and they were talking about exactly this issue in hospitals, where it's so compartmentalized that there's no one who has like the holistic view anymore. It's kind of like the human. It's kind of like the human body. Like you need to be aware of like these ripple effects and how different variables affect other variables. So you can't like blindly optimize one thing, because you'll 100% create a problem somewhere else in a way that you can't foresee before you do it ex ante.
Let me give, actually, I've got a really interesting, an analogy you might like there, which is my wife is in the last year and a half went through cancer treatment, and my sister-in-law, who's a veterinarian, advised us through it. And we now have this new thing, which is you always need a veterinarian in your lifeboat, because the practices aren't rich enough for them to specialize. And there is a fair amount of shared physiology between animals, especially when it comes to cancers and things like that. So that while we were getting, an oncologist and a radiologist and, and all these specialists, my sister-in-law was there with us explaining it all, because as a veterinarian, she has that view. And, I saw it recently. There was a comic, one of these, a meme comic thing that came out and said that if you go to another planet and you discover an entirely new species and then you get hurt, find their veterinarians, because their doctors only know how to treat the alien species, and they won't know how to treat a variety. Now, we didn't rely on Paige for medical advice. We relied on her to help interpret and understand and ask questions and things of our medical professionals. But it really helped kind of sew that all together. And so if you think about that, a veterinarian actually is dealing with all this at once. So some pet owner comes in with their dog, and their dog has a problem. Well, they've got to be able to sort it out, start to finish. Whereas in a medical office, you go in and the doctor says, well, here's this specialist A, and then you go to specialist A, says, okay, well, let's bring in specialist B. Then all of a sudden you're scattered all the way through the hospital, like you said.
Exactly. This is part of the problem why you learn so little in big companies, because you're an expert at a very, 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 very small sliver of the entire business. So it becomes very hard to, actually learn something beyond that tiny sliver. So when you become an entrepreneur or you want to do something else, then all of a sudden you realize there was this guy talking about how he started a particular company. I'm blanking. I believe it was also something in marketing, but he said that he worked with at this particular company. I believe it was Johnson & Johnson. And whenever he did SEO, whatever, they would just hire an agency, or when they needed research, etc. So then you think that you're like kind of aware of what's going on, but all of a sudden you don't have those resources, you're bootstrapping, and then you realize like, oh, now I need to do it myself and I have no clue. And there's a lot of stuff that you might not even be aware that you don't know, because it's like all hidden in the background, out of view at that big company. So that's
It's funny how that goes too, because I had when I went into General Dynamics straight out of school, thinking I was pretty hot. I'd gotten this job and all this stuff, and it ended up having a great boss, and he tells various stories. And so I was complaining at some point in time because I think my first project there was I worked on a network of Apple IIe's. And I'd come in for glory, not for Apple IIe's, and so I wasn't too thrilled by that. Although people would, people are fascinated by that experience today. But my boss, he made the observation that he'd been a radar guy in the Navy, and he'd always been on old ships with old radars. And what he figured out is that his compatriot on other ships with the new radars, all they knew how to do was board swap, whereas he knew how to take a radar apart. He knew the tubes, he knew all the stuff going on the boards because he'd worked on the old systems. So we got all excited about working on the fancy new stuff, but we sometimes don't learn the whole, So when I was working on those Apple IIs, I learned how an entire computer worked, even, against my will, but I learned it. And it was really valuable to me throughout my career because I started with this fundamental idea about, wait, these disk drives, I got to go buy the disk drive and then I got to connect it here. And then, okay, here's how memory is partitioned. And I learned all these details that all my compatriots who were only working on mainframes, none of them knew. We would just, press submit on a terminal and had no idea kind of how the whole thing was operating. And so I think there are times, especially for people who are going into entrepreneurism, you've got to be ready to want to dig into the details, learn how the engine works, because only by learning how the engine works can you discover your stuff about it. And big companies keep us away from that. We don't learn. I mean, I'm actually always interested in how many big company marketers really don't have much communications experience. They're put in charge of running advertising. But when you sit down and talk through, well, what do we need to communicate? That's our job because they don't really, they don't really know it. So anyway, I'm rambling on.
No. It's super interesting. First of all, there's just so much to learn. And that is true in mathematics as well.
Everything.
For the last probably like 150 years, there's more mathematics than you can learn in a lifetime. Probably somewhere like 1850 or whatever, you could still like be at the top of like, pretty much all of math, but that's, no chance right now. So there's a lot of information when it comes to marketing, but then there's also the problem where it's a soft field. So you're not really sure whether or not, what you're learning, if it's actually true. And that's something that I really struggle with. I think Bruce Clark, we talked about him before, Professor Clark, shout out.
Yep. Hey, Bruce.
I think his attitude kind of like rubbed off on me because he obviously as a professor does work really hard to separate nonsense from stuff that's true, but simultaneously he also has like a more laissez-faire, relaxed attitude, and is very open to learning, to acquiring information from different points of view. And I think especially in soft sciences, that's very important. That's also something that I see in Rory Sutherland as well. So maybe that is something that comes with age, where when you're younger, you have a very fixed view of something that you are 100% sure of, and then like 20 years later, you learn that it's completely false, and then maybe that teaches you to keep an open mind, or something.
Or you learn it's true in that context, but it's not true, or you learn all those things. I got to ask you, so what is your math? What's your math degree? We ought to swap our math credentials here.
No, I don't have a degree in math. I was studying econometrics in Tilburg University. Well,
that's pretty much a degree in math. So
it is, but I didn't finish it. I dropped out because I was working on a previous company and that was doing really well, and I was doing psychology and econometrics in that company, and they did tricking on a fairly high level. I do a sport of martial arts tricking with flips and all kinds of stuff. So it was too much to combine. So eventually I decided to drop out. But I've been continuing studying mathematics, and I do mathematics every single day. There's the painter Bob Ross. He said, every day that you painted is a good day, but my attitude is always every day that you did mathematics is a good day.
Do some math, it's a good day. Yeah, well, that's great. Yeah, because I was a numerical guy. I got my master's in numerical analysis, finite elements. So I'm all about PDEs and solving computer solutions. But I didn't, but it fit for me. Although I got halfway through it and realized it probably wasn't when I wanted to spend my career, because most most mathematicians in companies are backroom guys, and I'm just not that much of a backroom guy.
I see.
Because the mathematicians in companies, the engineers trot them out and say, "Look, we've got a mathematician. Now go away. Let's talk turkey." And
with me, it's actually really strange. For some reason, I'm extremely drawn to pure mathematics, and applied. It just I'm so bored. I just hate anything that's applied, which is super counterproductive. But I don't know. Like for example,
I don't. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I did a course, geometric topology, and it was given by Professor Tokida, and it was so much fun. The more abstract and useless it is, the more I enjoy it. But then something like which is very so optimization problems, which you see a lot in econometrics. It's not my cup of tea. But I'm actually thinking of going back to university and getting my bachelor's in mathematics because I really enjoy it. But something that I've been doing for the last half year or so is like filling up holes in my mathematical foundation, because I noticed as I was working on more complex mathematics that I had like trivial holes, because a lot of the early stage mathematics that you learn before you go to college, they teach it to you at a time where the likelihood that you're interested in mathematics is probably still fairly low, unless you're Terence Tao or whatever. So there's a big probability that all of the stuff that you learned that you forgot, and later on it's just kind of assumed that you know it, and maybe you kind of like remember the algorithm, but you don't really understand it, or you forgot it completely, and now you have like a huge hole because now you can't like continue because you don't know how to do a certain manipulation or whatever.
I commonly say that's true of a lot of high school geometry here in the U.S. because they teach us stuff like sines and logarithms and all this stuff, and until you have an application for it, I hated that stuff. I just hated that stuff. But once I had an application for it 4 years later in college courses, all of a sudden I'm like, okay, I get why this is there. I can do it just fine. But boy, up early, it was just incredibly frustrating because, and I think they do that a lot with math. There's a guy named Andrew Hacker, I think it is. But anyway, he writes about wanting to change general math education, not, add math education for, really becoming a mathematician, but the math education we give to everybody. Because we're not necessarily, he wants to see people more challenged with how do you analyze statistics, or how do you read a report, or how do you find out what's important in a situation, instead of how, algebra and things like that, which of course, me having gone through my stuff, I'm like, but the algebra is the fun stuff. Anyway, I think that's great. I mean, I think partly too, I will say from my complexity, and that the beauty of pure math is that, people think math and they think it's all logic, but no, it's a tremendous amount of imagination and kind of a lot of creativity that's involved. I remember from ages ago, a quote from a Russian mathematician in one of the books I used about how math is half logic and half imagination. And because, dealing with these things requires a part of our brain that is really, it's not just how do you logic your way through, but how do you envision what this might be in a way that's useful to you for figuring it out. And that's tough stuff. So.
Yeah, that is 100% true. The small caveat there is that you can only start to like appreciate and use that imagination part once you've reached mathematical maturity, because up until then you're still learning the language. Because a lot of the stuff that we call mathematics isn't really mathematics yet, because for example, in high school there are a lot of things where not a lot of things, like everything, you're just literally using definitions. It's almost like you're translating Chinese into English. It's like, this is the definition of something, and then because that is the definition of that thing, this follows, and because that follows, this follows, and now I'm allowed to do this manipulation, and now I have the answer. So that's it is like mathematics-ish. But what I miss, which is very different from having a conjecture and then working your way down to a proof. But what I really miss in the education, in high school education of mathematics, is they give you a collection of facts, and you're just supposed to learn it, and then it feels like almost like you're a secretary and you have a boss who says something and you need to type it, and it's the equivalent, but it's just with equations. So you have no idea, you're not interested in doing it, and you don't understand what you're doing it. And they gloss over two very important things. The first thing is, all of this stuff took forever for people to find out. So if you don't get it immediately in 5 minutes, you're not dumb. And that is something that I didn't realize. You don't realize because no one tells you. And so it kind of feels like people discovered this in real time, even though it took like 200 years to discover the thing that you're learning, you know? And also the connection between different fields. So you learn graphing in high school, and you also learn algebra, but no one talks about the brilliant, mind-blowing connection between those. They just mention it. It's like, okay, here's an equation of a polynomial, and ta-da, here's a downward opening parabola. And you're like, okay, you're just going through the motions. But they need to pause for 2 seconds and ask you, like, how can we like think about this through a different means? And now you're like co-discovering a Cartesian plane, for example, and now your mind is blown, because it takes a while to realize that you have two different tools to look at the same problem, which is just. And so many people, if you learn it through a high school approach, and you can even like college your way through college with this approach, just you figure out what you need to do, you execute the algorithm, and you get your degree, and you're
off and running it.
And it's perfectly possible. And now you lose that thing.
When I got excited about math in college, what was funny is I was taking calculus, and I took differential calculus, which I hated because it was clerical, you know, the difference thing where you do like, okay, here's the difference, and now do another difference, then okay, do a bunch of differences, and I'm like, oh God, I hate this stuff. And then we got into
algebra. It's algebra on steroids. Algebra teaches you to be precise with sign errors, and that's like on steroids.
Then we got into integral calculus, and I discovered that you could use this to calculate the volume of a donut or whatever. And it just went like, oh, this is the coolest thing, because it had a concept in it. And the concept was adding up an infinite number of infinitely small things and ending up with an answer. And it was like, oh my God, this is really cool. So, and that's where I also clicked into math could be far more than the drudgery we learned in high school. And you're right. I think, high school is just it's almost like anatomy. You got to be able to name all the bones in the body. Well, you got to be able to name all the mathematical concepts in algebra. No. You got to learn. You got to, I loved it when I got to the point of build a skill that you could use to understand things. That's when it starts being like, oh, this is really cool. And
also if you approach it that way, then the intrinsic motivation comes from the person themselves, because now I'm relearning all of and filling all the holes in like the more foundational mathematics, whereas like if you force someone to do that from day one and they don't like it, then you don't have the enrollment, and it's pretty much a non-starter. So it's so much easier. It's so much. You just make your life easier by doing that in the right order.
That's funny. That's
really fascinating. I got one more question for you, and then we can wrap up. You talked quite a bit about complexity, and I heard some other people talk about complexity as well in business. But the thing that I'm wondering is there's a whole mathematical subfield around complexity, and when people in business talk about like complexity and complexity science, are they referring to that mathematical thing, or is it like a new way of viewing business?
It's a tricky answer. I'll give you my approach, which is when I talk about complexity in business, I'm starting from, there's a field of complexity science, and the complexity in mathematics is a subfield of that. It's part of the complexity science work. It's centered a lot of it around the Santa Fe Institute in New Mexico, which was founded as a spinoff from Los Alamos National Labs. And they look at a lot of, fundamentally, they looked at unexpected things happening in the physical world and then going off to try to understand them. Right? Like, why did this, wait a minute, that's weird. We didn't expect that. What was it? In that process, they had to cross disciplines, because what they found out was things were happening that way because there were connections between things that weren't being accounted for. So even in fundamental physics, like if you look at say, pendulum equations that Da Vinci, crunched out. Galileo. They're accurate as long as you don't worry about air resistance or things like that. So, he says the period of a pendulum is going to be identical regardless. That's all fine until you get air resistance. And those are small nonlinear factors that he ignored. But at some point, we can't ignore them anymore. And so a lot of what the complexity people have run into is we made simplifying choices throughout science. And those simplifying choices missed out on things that were connected to each other. So that, friction is a small force, but it actually has tremendous impact. So you run into that pretty constantly. So what I'm doing is looking at that, and then from that they developed a thing called a complex adaptive system to kind of talk about these adaptive systems. And and that's not, to me, that's not the whole of complexity, but it's a really important development that came out of it. And what they know is that these complex adaptive systems have behaviors that you tend to see. And these things like connections and emergence and those kinds of behaviors are typical in a complex adaptive system. Well, when you look at it, business is a complex adaptive system. An economy is a complex adaptive system. So what we're doing is especially me, I'm looking at the science because I have enough scientists in me to do that. And then saying, well, what should we be learning from this? So the science seems to work this way. What implications might there be for business? And I do say fundamentally, the complexity folks have gotten to the point where they will say, look, it's about the whole system. And this fundamental, question of, can you reduce it into parts and analyze the parts separately, and then add the parts back up and get the overall behavior of the system? And on the other hand, complexity is a world of analyzing situations where the whole is more than the sum of the parts. So, for example, in science, somebody observes that water molecules have no wetness, no quality of wetness to them. Wetness only develops when you bring together a whole set of molecules. Wetness is something that emerges from within that. Well, think about that in business. Take a department. Departments have behaviors which are different than the individual behaviors of the members of the department, right? It does, and everything we do humanly, when you bring together a group of people, you have these unexpected things. And so complexity is really about how do those things develop, whether they're from people or from markets or from interactions. And kind of fundamental in my premise is that I think in business we can say profit to some degree is the measures the difference between the sum of the parts and the whole. If what you do adds up to just the sum of the parts, you're not really creating much value. Right. And in business, we're all about creating value. So there needs to be a surplus. And so we've got to be looking at how does that surplus come together? And what's a little bit disappointing is that there's not a thread in business that understands how to talk about how the whole comes together. But I think it's not there because for a few reasons, but one of them is complexity offers a way into that. We haven't really had a good way into looking at how it comes together. Unfortunately, it's not linear how it comes together. So I'm not able to write like your 7-step process for taking advantage of complexity. What I'm trying to do is write something that says, okay, how do we think about this? What are the fundamentals for us to think about this? And write about case studies of companies that thought about it and saw things come out good or bad, because complexity can result, the sum of the whole may be more devastating than the sum of the parts.
Interesting. I'm actually talking on Wednesday with a mathematician friend, and he did his PhD, or he's doing his PhD. I'm not sure whether or not he got it yet, on complexity. So I twisted his arm to have a chat with him to see, what can we learn that we can use and apply in the entrepreneurial context as well. Let me quickly ask you. There's a lot of marketing science work done in Australia, with EBI, obviously, and we talked about things can be true under different circumstances, and also things can be true, but they can become false. Things that are false can become true. So there's a lot of how do you separate astronomy from astrology? A lot of the work that they are doing is trying to answer these questions. Be it sharp with loyalty or what have you. What's your take on that? Like, do you think like all of that stuff, good work, great, or do you feel like we need to be a little bit careful with, interpreting that stuff, and maybe there are domain issues again with the big brand stuff and the big firms versus like bootstrappers, etc. What's your take on that?
I think it's actually a little bit of both. I mean, fundamentally, I think Sharp's work is brilliant, and he's very careful. He and I had a brief conversation about ideographic and nomothetic, and that they really try to understand the limits of what they're talking about and where does this work or not. They are finding some things which, as principles, are fundamentally true, like the double indemnity,
double jeopardy,
jeopardy, rather. Yeah, it's double indemnity. Sorry, double jeopardy. That the law of double jeopardy seems to be a pretty solid thing, and I've used it with clients a lot. And they've found some other things like, the media schedules. There's a lot of hype in the business about doing a crunched media schedule where you dump all the media at once and, for big splash. And that there's, some of their research shows that you're better off to spread the media, so that running a low level of even media over a long period of time is more effective than two big spikes. And I've done that for clients and agree with them on that stuff. So I think a lot of it, I think fundamentally they're very careful and they're very good. I think there are two dangers. One is that some of the individual things get washed out in their statistical analysis, right? One of the dangers of statistics is that we can lose the individuality of something. So for example, this is not their research. So I'm going with a super simple idea if you're not their research, but there's studies out there that say that all things being equal, humor gets ads more remembered. Right. Well, what you have to do is challenge the all things being equal. All things are never equal. Is the ad for a tool, and I'm a tool guy and I care about tools, or is the ad for dish soap and I don't give a hoot? Right. What the product in the ad is matters far more for memory than the style of the ad. So, we can't come to conclusions like that. So there's a danger sometimes that when we look for commonalities, we sometimes are misleading, because looking for commonalities ignores the individual reality.
That's a great point.
I think, to me, that's the one danger. And I can't point to anything I'd say, oh, hey, they've done this wrong because of this or that. I think maybe on differentiation versus distinction, I think that argument has been fascinating to watch over the last bit, because I think it's some of both. That's where I kind of come down. And I kind of don't believe in the either or. I do think that what Byron Sharp is fighting against with his arguments there against is the silly differentiation that's done by a lot of companies.
That's true.
Where they come out and say, oh, I'm intentionally different.
Exactly. We're different for the sake of being different.
I've been in some of those meetings and they're just absurd. They're just absurd. And I worked with one company who was out there looking for what's going to make us different. They were insurance from AAA, and they're like, well, are we better at this thing or that thing or that thing? And I read the focus group reports. It's just reading the reports. But kept coming back is, well, you're different because you're insurance from AAA. Forget all that other stuff. That's the one thing nobody could compete with you on. Nobody can argue with you about it. It's your one advantage. And they went that way, and it worked really well for them. But, they got caught up in that silliness of, what makes us different by product features instead of what makes us different as a whole, which is no one else can say they're AAA. Car insurance. So I think so that's the one place where I'm just not sure. It feels like some of the conclusions come back. I wish that there was a better sense of, so when does individuality make a difference in this? Like, advertising effectiveness. I keep saying most advertising agencies couldn't sell their way out of an open box because they don't have that level of salesmanship. Now, for a lot of their work, they don't need it. But unfortunately, they also aren't aware that they're missing that salesmanship. So in entrepreneur work, salesmanship really matters, because that's what moves the first products out the door. That's what goes along. And so that's one where they say, well, we don't see any distinction about this. And I'm like, that could be that it just washed out in the fact that you're averaging and not,
That's really a good point. you were talking about the salesmanship, etc. Does that also mean that you were influenced in the direct marketing world by people like Gary Halbert, etc., or not really?
I don't know that name. I mean, what ended up happening for me is I had been a salesman, and for the supercomputer company I'd sold and marketed, and I had been their international pitch man for a year. I traveled Europe and Japan and Korea and Australia pitching the product. I was the guy that would go in, and we had a local sales force, didn't know anything about the product, so I was there to pitch it. And so I got a lot of experience from there. I kind of came to it without necessarily reading a lot of other people saying what it should be. I came there because I had my own instincts, and they proved out to be pretty right on. I mean, it all came down to how do I sell this product,
Yeah.
And I confront that a lot. So, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, what caused you to make that switch from being like a very technical mathematics, etc., to going to the dark side and going into marketing, etc.?
Yeah, there's a lot of things. At the same time, I started getting involved with visual creative stuff a lot more. I met my wife taking art classes, painting and drawing classes, and she's an artist, and started hanging. So I always had this desire to be around more than just tech, I suppose. And I mean, the big motivator was I was in between jobs, and I would go into job interviews for tech jobs and then come out and go, okay, I need to write all my letters. I need to get my references, or I could go fishing. And when I discovered that fishing was winning out far more than what I needed to do to get that job, I had to stop and pay attention to what my instincts were telling me, because they were setting off the alarm bells that, no, you don't really want to do that. You just don't know it yet. And my behavior was that I didn't want to do it, but my mind kept saying, that's what you should do. And then through that, an opportunity came up.
It's so funny that you say that, because in Intro to Behavior Design, that was one of the first things that I mentioned. This is something that's very common. Behavior design, it always starts with something that you want, not something that you should. And it applies to your to your users or your consumers or your subjects as well. You start with the want. The best people, who have the most expertise in terms of behavior design aren't teachers, because teachers can use like the metaphorical whip to whip their students into shape. It's game designers, because game designers, they need to make a video game, and if people don't like it and they don't play the video game, there's no whip. So you can't like force people to play a video game, and if they don't like it, they won't buy it, and then pretty soon you won't have a video game company anymore. So the only way to make good video games is to have to incorporate solid behavior design. So a lot of behavior design practices come from the practitioners in that particular field, who have noticed certain things. So one of the things that they have noticed is, don't start with level 10 boss in level 1. Because everyone will give up. So make level 1 simple, and then make level 2 a little bit harder, and like that gradual escalation. And when you observe your own behavior design in your own life, you will notice that a lot of these principles you don't actually apply.
Yeah, I mean, and actually, it's funny because I think what I've seen out of the games is that you want to have eventually really, really hard levels so that you have something challenging. But you can't start there. You've got, and it's a whole, I think that's a good point. So, I mean, for me, so then I recognized that I had an accident that a friend of mine was the partner in this producer that made, these infomercial ads. So I started doing business plans for them. That was my first thing, is for customers. I would actually do the business planning of, okay, if you do this, what's the impact? Developing spreadsheets that tried to lay out a P&L based on the costs and all those things coming together, and what the impact might be, straw men, if you will, for what you might get as a result of this. So they hired me, and the funny thing was they hired me, and then the first week somebody comes to my office, says, we have a project for Revlon. They're doing focus group work in Charlotte on Thursday. Can you be there? And I'm like, I guess so. I guess I can. And very quickly got drawn into a full research role. I think it surprised him, because I do think that the guy who was the president, who I never really gelled with, I think he thought, well, we brought in this guy, this geek, to just run spreadsheets, and all of a sudden he's talking to us about how our communication should work. And But I did know it because I'd been selling for so long and had an instinct for sales. And then turned out I had an instinct for consumers and consumer research. There's the other part, which is when you're selling supercomputers, you go to a party and people say, "Oh, what do you do?" And you say, "Well, I'm selling supercomputers. I just sold one to Caltech where they're doing quantum chemistry on it." And people will say, "Oh, that's really nice." Then I go to, so when I was working with O Cedar on kitchen sponges for $3 a piece, it was like I'd made it, I'd made it into the real world, the world that matters to the individual, because the computer thing is great, but what really matters is what kind of sponge am I using to clean my dishes tonight? That's something that affects us all every day.
As seen on TV.
Yeah, I see it on TV. Yep, and here we were, selling, that kind of stuff. But I liked it because it's much more human. It's what we interact with all the time. I say that people became consumers the minute we preferred one rock over another rock for our sling. Or when we stayed in the cave we were in as opposed to a much better, drier cave because we didn't want to move. That's really old human reaction.
Yeah,
I think it's been part of us all along. So it's kind of fun to be involved with it. I actually have tremendous fun with the weirdness that I get to have gotten involved with. But.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. I always enjoy talking to people who have a mathematical background because mathematics is so different. I think one of the reasons why I enjoy doing pure mathematics so much because I feel like when I'm studying things in the entrepreneurial science world, you never know whether or not you're wasting your time. Are you learning stuff that will turn out to be nonsense 5 or 10 years from now? Even though the people in question have taken all precautions to be as careful as possible, because it's just the nature of soft fields. And that's not the case in mathematics. Like if something is proven, then it will stay true forever. So I think that kind of gives me a peace of mind that I'm actually learning something.
I've got this solid base, and then there's everything else out of it.
Yes, so, I might be a complete idiot in entrepreneurial science, but at least I know a few things that are true. But
listen, in this space, 1 + 1 always equals 2. Not that space, but this space.
Yes. Exactly. But that is one of the things that one of the critiques that people in hard sciences levy against people in soft sciences, which I always have a problem with, which is essentially this notion that the soft sciences aren't science, etc. And they kind of look down on soft sciences. But I feel like the reason why mathematics is straightforward, so not necessarily easy, but straightforward, is not because of the brilliance of mathematicians. It just happens to be the case. The same with physics. So you gave the example of doing an experiment where you have minuscule variables which don't play a role and don't mess up the experiment, so you can leave them out. So you can get an extremely good approximation of reality by using an extremely simple model, which is the case of gravity and pretty much all of classical mechanics. But why is that the case? It's not because physicists are brilliant. It's just that nature just happens to work that way. And in mathematics, replication is very easy because all you need is a pen and a blackboard, and you just write the equation again. So you can constrain all the variables. Try doing that with psychology. And with psychology, there are all these minuscule variables which are equivalent to friction. But in physics, we can easily just leave it out. And I'm throwing an object here, and it doesn't matter. And then in psychology, it has huge ripple effects. So maybe something like mood, for example, and the mood of a subject, it creates huge problems in terms of replication effects, for example. And so the difficulty of keeping the variables the same, and the issues with the lack of being able to find very clear general laws because these experiments are so difficult to replicate. I think that's just part of the game. It's what makes soft sciences very interesting, but also very difficult.
Well, I think actually, as you're talking about that, this is where, you go and dig into complexity science, you start finding these areas of, kind of where is what. Ecology and life sciences, like, evolution and the like, are really valuable for insights into business because they show.
Do you know Professor? Do you know Professor Godsod? He specializes in using evolutionary psychology in order to explain consumer psychology and consumer buying behavior, essentially.
I don't. If you had something for me to read about, as a start, it'd be interesting.
Yes.
I think I'm looking at there's a guy named Stuart Kaufman who has been real involved. Kaufman, Kauffman,
an author,
and
right?
He's written what's that?
An author, right?
Yeah, author, and he's real involved with the Santa Fe Institute, and he's done a lot of work on evolution and how could it have happened. Especially, he got to start from the point of view of everybody says, well, the idea that life got created was almost infinitely impossible, and it just happened. So it was so risky. And he's come back and done analysis, said, no, actually, he has a theory that there's kind of a nature desires a kind of order. And some things are actually pretty likely. And so he's shown how it might have happened that's not nearly as odd as people, might say. One of his observations is that he kind of does the attack on the idea that physics could explain the whole universe. The old idea that if we knew where every particle was at this point in time and had the computing power, we could predict the entire future and find the entire past.
Laplace's demon.
Yeah, Laplace's demon. And he observes that, once you look at evolution, this is where he comes into ergodicity. He says that the truth is it's not an ergodic process. In other words, the number of paths that have been tried by life is tiny compared to the number of paths that could have been tried by life. That evolution is filled with, well, all we know is that this species survived because it worked at that point in time. What we can't say is it's the best species. And I think this has big impact for business because we spend all of our time in business saying, what's the best? What's the best? Maybe there is no best because we're dealing with so many flavors. All we can say is that this worked and that didn't work. And we can't even explain all the contextual reasons why that didn't work. But we have this work that didn't work. And
I agree with that 1,000,000%. And the best example of not respecting that, because you are respecting that, because you are the one who just shared that information, is all of these companies who mistake the model for reality, essentially. So let me give an example of industry. Take vacuum cleaners. Everyone knew that a vacuum is, something that you have to buy. You don't really, who wants to buy it? Everyone hates vacuuming in the first place. So clearly that's not an item that you can charge a premium for until Dyson. So, and then you get someone who opens up this entirely new market. And now this is essentially what you were talking about, like in terms of ergodicity, like there's one path, it has been heavily optimized to death. And now you get essentially this game theory view where you have all these players and everyone is competing, and the price tumbles until it reaches a Nash equilibrium. But then someone comes along and just throws the entire game board off of the table and invents a new game, and that's essentially then Dyson. And then he shows that clearly it is possible to charge a premium for vacuums.
To do that. You might really enjoy, there's two people I might recommend out of complexity that you read, one being Brian Arthur, who's an economist out of Stanford, and he's done complexity economics. And he also is very good friends with Stuart Kaufman, and Kaufman's the other one I'd recommend to you. And they've worked together a lot, especially around kind of how the economy is a complex adaptive system and what can you learn from evolutionary that applies in the economy. The only thing I'll say is that neither of them has a ground in consumer behavior. And it's kind of the one disappointing thing to me out of their work is it's brilliant work, but they don't include, it's kind of like if you look at the economy as this complex adaptive system, it's paralleled by a complex adaptive system for the consumer. So, Arthur has written about how technology gets developed. It's like evolution. So this technology comes out. What he doesn't write about is that parallel to that, for that technology to score, there has to be a development among customers so that technology that came out is valued. Because just merely coming out with the technology is not all it takes. It takes people caring. And so you've got another, and it's kind of, to me, it's like they're parallel systems here. because a lot of consumer values don't change as fast as technology changes. So we all have a desire to print what we write on the computer. And at one point in time, we were doing that on dot matrix printers, and then on laser printers, and then inkjet printers.
Jobs to be done.
Yeah, so those are all changing. But down the path here, we haven't really changed what our desire is very much as humans. But but those desires eventually do evolve, and so you've got to, it's kind of this matching between those two, which has to do with what product work. In the marketplace.
That's one of the reasons why I like jobs to be done so much as a model, because now you're looking at it through the lens of like, what job is the consumer trying to achieve versus the old school model where it was more like, let's just randomly choose a gender and choose a hobby and choose a city, and you create this artificial niche. We were talking about something earlier, and you mentioned something. You were talking about business and how people make different features and in terms of differentiation, etc. And all of these issues stem from not having a clear marketing strategy. Because if you're very clear at the top, all of that stuff like flows out of it, which is one of the reasons why I'm such a huge fan of ethnography. Because if you understand the users really well, etc., jobs to be done. Same thing with jobs to be done. Because then it's not like, should we make this to use Professor Christensen's example, the McDonald's milkshake? Then it's not, should we make the milkshakes thicker, more viscous, or less viscous? If you understand the jobs to be done, then that question, you can answer it logically, because you understand, you have a constraint essentially.
Yeah, I mean, part of my, I have mixed feelings about it, because I think, it's kind of right to its point. And it's one of, I guess I look at, we all
it's a tool. Quivers. It's a tool.
We have quivers of tools. And so as one of many tools, I think it's great. It's one of many tools. It's just not the only one. And, it gets tough because Ulwick believes it's the only one because he gets consulting dollars for it. That which gets a little rough. But on the other hand, there is real truth to it. I tend to prefer the term value. And this is where I've moved in so in fact, I teach my students that there's features, benefits, and value. So let's take a TV as a simple example. It's a 62-inch TV.
Yes, it's a feature.
The benefit is you get a big, rich view. Maybe you get a more emotional feed out of it, something like that. But the value of the TV in the household may be that it's a way the family comes together.
I see.
So in fact, that's kind of, and I wouldn't say that that's the TV's job, because the way the family comes together depends on the TV and the furniture and the design of the house. I mean, it's like, it's part of a system. So it's kind of, and so I think it is not that for every product, Crest made huge headway advertising fluoride toothpaste. So they advertised a feature back in the 50s and 60s. So I think given it's all this circumstance-based stuff, sometimes it's value that's most important, sometimes it's benefits most important, sometimes it's features, sometimes it's a mix. I just like having one step further, not to go crazy on laddering. I know, at some level, every product is about self-realization. But I don't kind of, I think that's kind of like,
you go from Starbucks
who gives,
saving the world.
But I do think that there's an important thing to look at, say value, because it starts also looking at the connections between your product and the products around it. Because, so for example, you put the 62-inch TV into a living room that has no furniture, it's not going to be enjoyed much if family is the value you want from the TV. And
how do you create the separation between value and benefits? Because one could argue, devil's advocate, that the value is in itself a benefit. So how do you?
I think where I'm moving to, I get there like I do a lot of things. Instinctively, it feels important that there is a separation there. There's a little overlap in the middle, but I know a lot of benefits, such as
maybe just a layer deeper, essentially.
It's a layer deeper or a layer, but also I think if we look at complexity and the need to deal with connections, it's an overt step into how does it connect, right? So if we stick with benefits and say benefits are what the product offers me,
yes,
but then I have to look at how does the product connect within the person's life. So that's where I'm really ending up, is that it's about the connection then from that product amongst other products. And for research, what that would say is if you want to dig into TVs, then you may need to recruit customers based on what their living room setup is.
Yes,
not just what their TV desires are.
Exactly.
So I think that's really what happens, because there are these connections. When we worked with the drill doctor, that drill bit sharpener, we found out that I think it was 60% of people who bought it owned an air compressor, which is a major step up in the shop. And so you've got this connection that you can look at and say, well, what does that imply about the product? That tells us volumes, because all of a sudden now we understand a style and a type of shop.
That's fascinating.
So, so I think the connections may be more important than we know, but sorry.
This is the first time that I've encountered this idea. Is this something that you came up with?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, I haven't patented it yet, but trademarked it. But no, it's been, a lifetime of a little bit of frustration of it started with a frustration that people, a lot of marketing people say, well, it's all about benefits.
Yes, that's true. Especially
in the copy world. Because
that's true.
Yeah, in the copy world, it's all about benefits. No, actually, you know what? If somebody has a drill and they're very smart, and you're appealing to an expert market, it may be about features, because they may know exactly what that feature implies to them. The Crest toothpaste having fluoride, they built what that implied as a benefit, but it was much better communication for them to say, with fluoride, than to say, because everything gets fuzzy. You know how benefits get fuzzy, right?
Yeah.
It has fluoride. Oh, that carries a lot. The benefit, you get
because
less cavities.
There's a consumer heuristic. Exactly. Yes, because then you have a consumer heuristic where it's like fluoride equals good. So it's like non-fluoride, fluoride. They do the same thing in skincare, where they demonize parabens, I believe it's pronounced. I'm not 100% sure, but it's like this additive that you use in skincare products where it decreases bacterial growth, and it makes sure that the product stays, good for a long period of time. And there's nothing wrong with it, but they created this enemy out of that ingredient. So now it became this marketing term where it's like a paraben free, and
free,
and they marketed it in such a way that consumers created the heuristic that meant it's good. Oh, hang on.
Yeah, I think that's true. I've just lost your picture, but
yes,
there you are.
I should be back now.
Okay.
Everything is dying. My ears are dying.
Oh, sorry. Well, we've been talking for a while, so what can I say? I think that's the other part is this. Once I kind of questioned the benefit versus feature, then I started thinking, well, what is missing for me in benefits? And a lot of lists of benefits I see don't really connect into life. And in fact, I've talked to ad agency people and said, well, once you talk about, what do you have beyond brand? And they said features. And I'm like, oh, Lordy, no, it's what does somebody get out of this? So that when we did that advertising for the drill bit sharpener, we talked about doing better quality work. We talked about getting more work done because you don't have to stop and go buy a new bit, right? So we talked about these values, and that's what transformed it, because the company had come to me and said, well, this product saves time and saves money. And I went, no, that's not it. And we went out and did research and figured out that no, it wasn't it.
You need to ask. You need to ask according to whom. Benefit according to whom.
Yeah, benefit according to whom. Well, and this was a question of what do these people care about? So it's about their work. It's not about the drill bit in this case. Yes. It's about their work. And so when you say, hey, you won't damage your material, they love that. Or you say you're getting better quality work done, they love that. Or you're getting more done. We ended up accidentally on that one. We had a testimonial guy who was a really skilled worker. He said, well, you know how it is when you keep your momentum going, you get more done. And that was his connection to, if you could sharpen your bit in a shop and not have to go buy a new one, you keep your momentum going and you get more done. And those things, so I started looking at it and going, boy, those don't even just really fit in benefit. I mean, yes, we could call them that, but maybe we'd be better off looking at this bigger picture out here of value. So that's why I end up teaching these three, and it's fuzzy between benefit and value. I admit that, and my students struggle with it too.
Everything is fuzzy in marketing. It's just the nature of the field. That's a really useful way of thinking about it. As I like how you explained it, where and also like when you talk about benefits usually takes on a very me focused perspective, where it's like, okay, I see these features of the product, and now I am going to translate them into benefits that I think should apply to you, the consumer. Whereas value takes more of the perspective of the consumer, because now you're thinking more about like how they will perceive the product versus like, you know, you telling them this is the benefit and you should care about this is the feature that the product has and you should care about it because it has this benefit for you. And the consumer is like, well, no, because I don't care about that. So interesting. All right. I think we should wrap this up. We've been at it for close to 2 hours, but we should definitely do this again. This has been super interesting.
Absolutely. This has been tremendous fun. So and I love these topics, and I really love what you're doing with entrepreneurial work, because it's a focus that is, you know, pretty desperately needed, and you just don't see much of it. And a lot of it's pretty flaky, you know, and you're right. I mean, in the US, up here in Oregon, we're so close to Silicon Valley that, you know, we pretty much get the overflow, and it's frustrating. So I like what you're doing.
Just making an attempt. If people just try, you know, then something will emerge eventually. Good stuff will emerge.
Absolutely. Yeah, there you go. Stay on the emergence.
All right, great. Well, this has been awesome. Thank you again. I had an absolute blast, and it was a pleasure meeting you, man.
Great. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it, and have a great rest of Sunday, whatever's left of it. So
you too. Take care. Bye-bye.
All right. Peace.